Welcome back to the deep dive. So if our last deep dive was all about defining the walls of the maze, figuring out what deviance is, then today's mission is about mapping the maze itself. We're moving past these isolated definitions and looking at the system. How does deviance actually happen, and what's this vast, often invisible machinery that society uses to govern our behavior?
That's the essential intellectual pivot, really. We're rejecting that simple, individualistic explanation for a deviant act.
Right.
Sociologists, drawing from key sources, insist that deviance isn't some spontaneous aberration. We have to analyze it as a deviant event, a process that's embedded in this complex social fabric.
So if you remove the context, you basically lose the meaning.
You lose everything, exactly.
And that focus on process seems vital, because it immediately challenges that impulse to just say, oh, that person is simply bad. It forces us to ask, under what circumstances did this behavior get defined as bad? And how did the system react? And as soon as we talk about reaction, we're talking about social control.
Exactly. Control is the counterpart to deviance. And the foundational work by Jack Gibbs gives us this really crystal clear functional definition of it, and it strips away all the moral judgment.
Okay.
He defines social control as any overt behavior by a human in the belief that the behavior increases or decreases the probability of some subsequent condition, and the increase or decrease is desirable.
That sounds a little dense, but what it boils down to is intention, right? Control is intentional, it's belief-driven behavior, and it's all designed to manage norms.
Yes.
So if I think my action's a dirty look, a fine, even a public compliment will change your future behavior in a way I want, that's an act of social control.
Precisely. It's all about that purposeful management of outcomes.
Okay, so let's unpack that central concept then, the deviant event. If we're rejecting this idea of a spontaneous, isolated act, what are the key pieces of context we absolutely need to look at?
Well, we need 4 dimensions. 2 are pretty obvious. You've got the deviant and the victim, the people involved.
Sure.
But the real sociological insight comes from the other 2. First, you have to look at the specific circumstances that brought them together. Was it chance, work, a crowded bus?
And the second one?
And second, and this is so crucial, you have to examine the history between the deviant and the victim.
The history. Okay, so that really underscores the temporal nature of this. It's not just a snapshot.
It's never a snapshot. Think about a seemingly simple act of assault. If you only look at the moment it happened, it might look accidental.
Right.
But if that event is part of a, say, decade-long pattern of escalating threats, a looming danger in a history of domestic violence, the meaning of the act changes completely. Deviance is cumulative.
That makes perfect sense.
Right.
But I assume the context extends beyond just the 2 main actors. It also has to include the environment, maybe even people who are just watching.
Absolutely. The event is profoundly shaped by the audience, their presence, their absence, and their capacity to react. This is why we say deviance is situationally contingent. That big, boisterous joke you tell at a friend's party might be considered workplace harassment if you repeated it in the middle of a board meeting. The environment changes the definition of the act itself.
And the environment itself can concentrate, or I guess, reduce deviance. And that brings us to the idea of deviant places.
Yes. Deviant places are physical environments that concentrate the opportunity for norm violation. And crucially, they normalize specific negative behaviors.
So like a neighborhood where visible decay, broken windows, graffiti, that kind of thing, signals that maybe informal social controls are weak or just absent.
Precisely. When you have that visible disorder, it's not just an aesthetic problem, it sends a social message.
What's the message?
It signals to potential deviants that behavior that would be severely sanctioned elsewhere might just be tolerated here. This normalization, in turn, makes the environment a magnet for more serious deviance. You're literally governing deviance as much by where it happens as by what happens.
So the event is structured by the interaction of time, place, and the history of the actors.
All of it.
This focus on context seems to lead us naturally to a discussion about identity. We've established that context matters, but if someone commits a norm violation, when do we stop saying they committed a deviant act and start saying they occupy a deviant role?
And that distinction is paramount. Most people who commit a deviant act, even something like theft or drug use or minor fraud, they don't do it all the time.
Right. They still have other conventional roles: parent, employee, neighbor.
Exactly. The sociological challenge is to analyze whether the social reaction to that act is strong enough to fundamentally reorganize the person's identity.
So the act is momentary, but the role. The role is a total commitment. That sounds like where Lamarck's concepts of primary and secondary deviance come in.
They are critical, and they introduce what we call the irony of social control. Primary deviance refers to those initial norm violations that are situational and don't really alter the individual's self-concept yet.
Okay, so the person sees it as a slip-up, an accident, not a reflection of who they are. Like a corporate executive who pads an expense account. It's fraud, a deviant act, but they might rationalize it, as something they're entitled to or just a one-off thing. They still see themselves as a legitimate executive.
Exactly. Now, the shift occurs with secondary deviance. This emerges when this social reaction, the labeling, the punishment is applied, and the individual starts to maybe participate in a deviant subculture or just reorganizes their life around that label.
They internalize it.
They do. So that same executive, after being fired and publicly disgraced, might start stealing client lists and selling them. They acquire the knowledge, the rationalizations. They fully embrace the role of a corporate criminal.
So the very attempt by society to control the deviance, the labeling, the shaming, is what can inadvertently push the person into a full-fledged deviant role. The reaction created the permanent problem. That's the irony.
It is. The initial reaction can turn a situational lapse into a master status.
Wow. This transition from reaction to identity. It's the perfect segue into the regulation side of our topic. Social control. If control is the attempt to manage outcomes, it seems to operate through two fundamental processes working at the same time.
It does. The first, and maybe the most pervasive, is the internalization of group norms. This is the invisible power. Through socialization from parents, schools, the media, we learn and accept norms to the point where just complying feels natural.
It feels moral.
It feels like doing the right thing. It's the self-policing mechanism.
This is why we stop at a red light at 3 a.m. with no one else around. It's not the fear of a ticket, the fear of violating our own moral code.
Precisely. That's the invisible power that keeps social order stable. It makes obedience feel like virtue.
And the second process?
The second process is the overt one. Sanctioning. This is the social reaction, the carrot or the stick-to behavior.
Right. And sanctions come in two flavors. You have positive sanctions rewards that encourage compliance, like praise or a bonus, and then negative sanctions, which are the punishments that discourage deviance, like criticism or fines.
And these sanctions are delivered through two types of control. The first is informal social control, which is unofficial. It's the actions of individuals or small groups, gossip, a disapproving glance from a neighbor, a cheer from your friends.
And this is most effective in communities where people share close relationships.
Absolutely.
It's that silent power of community expectation. I mean, think about a family dinner where your grandmother's watching everything you do. Her expression alone is often way more powerful than a formal warning.
It is. But when those informal networks break down, or when the deviance is just too severe, society has to lean on formal social control. These are organized systems of reaction from specialized agencies. The police, the courts, HR departments.
And these systems rely on specific people to administer the sanctions, who we call agents of social control.
Yes, whether it's the manager administering a dismissal, a judge imposing a sentence, or a medical board revoking a license, these agents are formally charged by society to determine the reaction.
Which brings us to the law, the most visible and consequential formal system. Legal sanctions are severe, from fines and probation all the way to incarceration and execution, but we also see powerful civil penalties, like injunctions.
Injunctions are a fascinating tool of formal control. They are orders to terminate a specific activity, to cease construction, stop protesting in a certain area, things like that.
And their power is that they're often proactive, right?
Yeah.
They're designed to prevent the act from happening in the first place, rather than just punishing it after the fact.
That's a huge point. It shows the preemptive reach of state control.
But when we look at the whole legal system, we have to ask the critical question: where do these laws actually come from? The sources identify two major, often competing views on this.
We have the consensus view, which argues that law emerges to embody and reflect the strong, shared moral sentiment of the majority. So essentially, everyone agrees murder is wrong, so we make it illegal. The law is just a neutral mirror of morality.
Okay, that's one view.
But then you have the much more challenging conflict view, which argues that law reflects the successful actions of powerful groups, those with political or economic capital, to legislate according to their own interests.
And this is where the conversation gets really interesting. The conflict view would suggest that laws regulating, say, corporate tax evasion might be weak, while laws targeting street-level drug use could be incredibly harsh, disproportionately affecting certain communities.
Exactly. The system is designed to preserve the status quo of those in power.
So it seems like the truth is probably an uncomfortable mix of both. A law might start with a broad consensus against harm, but its enforcement and its structure often reflect a conflict of interest that just gets naturalized as the way things are.
Precisely. The law becomes a political tool that masks its contested origins by claiming everyone agrees. This also forces us to consider the limits of the law itself. I mean, should the state regulate private moral behavior? Philosophers like John Stuart Mill argued the state should only exercise power over citizens to prevent harm to others.
But if we follow that other moral argument, that law should just codify the beliefs of the majority, we risk creating laws that don't prevent harm, but actively create new problems.
That's the ultimate irony in the creation of law. Laws against consensual behaviors like prostitution or drug sales don't eliminate the activity, they just push it underground.
Right, they generate black markets, organized crime, violence, all things that wouldn't exist if the behavior were regulated differently.
The law solves one problem while actively creating several others.
This whole deep dive, the context, the identity shift, the mechanisms of control, the politics of law, it forces us to recognize that deviance and control aren't just oppositional forces. They are, in fact, mutually constitutive. They create each other.
And we see this dynamic illustrated perfectly in sources that reference works like V for Vendetta. The state in that story establishes a fascist regime through aggressive social control, using surveillance and propaganda to create moral certainty.
So that system defines deviance labeling V a terrorist as an administrative move to trigger specific, harsh sanctions.
Yeah.
It forecloses any chance for the public to sympathize with his cause.
But the repression itself generates the very thing it seeks to destroy. These acts, instead of being suppressed, are amplified. The anonymity, the spectacle. It forces the regime to manage the deviance as a powerful symbol, not just an individual.
And when the sanctions imposed by the state are experienced by the people not as protection, but as illegitimate domination, the control system starts to collapse.
Yes.
The moment obedience shifts from feeling like virtue, from that internalization, to feeling like a calculated necessity fueled by fear, that social order becomes incredibly brittle. It's the ultimate feedback loop.
That is the conceptual synthesis. Societies actively produce and manage deviance through selective enforcement and the design of their institutions. Understanding deviance fundamentally means understanding the system built to regulate it.
That brings us to the close of this deep dive. We've moved from the isolated act to the contextual deviant event, incorporating place, time, and history. We covered the crucial difference between a deviant act and a deviant role, often because of the irony of social control. And we recognize that law is a deeply political mechanism, not some neutral mirror, functioning through both formal and informal controls.
And if we can leave you with one final thought, consider this. If social control is most powerful when it's internalized, how might the rapid changes in technology and global connectivity alter the capacity of formal institutions to maintain control when that internalization breaks down? I mean, when an algorithm, whether it's on a social media platform or in a facial recognition system, recommends a punishment or rewards compliance, where does that fall on the formal versus informal sanctioning spectrum? Does it look more like a friendly nudge or a state-mandated order?
It challenges the very definition of who the agent of social control even is. Think about that relationship between technology, the self, and the state as you move forward. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.